War is truly horrible. Most people can't even begin to imagine what it must be like to be in the theater of war. The horror and the atrocities of World War II was bad, sure, especially in present-day Belarus, Ukraine and Russia. But as we shall see in this video, living in fear of war is a normal state of being and has been for quite some time. For the next few minutes, I'll look at this huge area where the RUS Vikings settled and created so many principalities, which over time became states, and as you will see, they were called White Rus, Black Rus and Red Rus. It looked very promising early on, and the history is quite similar in all these areas where the Rus made their principalities. But then a huge disaster changed everything, and I'll tell you all about that. Have you ever wondered why the Ukrainian and Swedish flags are so similar in color? This has got to do with the roots of both states back in the 1200s. But it actually goes much further back in time, because these are the two original tribes of Sweden and their colors. And this is also why the Swedish and Ukrainian national teams have so similar colors. But mind you, this goes much further back in time, before the Viking Age, when the Germanic tribes migrated out of Scandinavia, both southwards but also eastwards, and even settled on Crimea. And this even includes the early history of Poland and Moldova and parts of Slovakia even. The reason why I want to make this video is because of two things. One is something Putin said and wrote, which I will show you now. And the other one is the reports from teachers in Russia that they now have to tell a whole new story, as you can see here, about the origin and similarities of Belarusians, Ukrainians and Russians and their history. I have to say I found this very interesting. And let's hear what Putin has to say.
Очень. При этом, если часть людей, которые проживают, значительная часть на Украине сегодня считают, что они должны бороться за, подчеркивать свою идентичность, бороться за это. Ну, у нас в России никто против этого ничего не имеет. Я тоже. Но просто мы имеем в виду, что у нас много общего.
I agree, and that's what I'm going to do here, though mind you from a Viking perspective. Because, as Putin recently wrote, to have a better understanding of the present and look into the future, we need to turn to history. And he goes on, Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus. And he mentions both the Orthodox faith and the spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir. And I'll get to him because he was a Prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev. And this, he writes, still largely determines our affinity today. And I'll throw in a map here now, which all the children in Russian schools will learn. And as you might see, and especially the observant Scandinavian surely will see, now Russia is operating with different historical maps than what we've been used to. So this great disaster happened in the year 1223. It's called the Battle of Kalka River, and it was the first crushing defeat by the Golden Horde before they eventually settled and conquered all of the Rus principalities in different ways, and really split them up by using divide and conquer. In this battle, the Mongols used a tactic of feigned retreat, seemingly escaping for 9 days. And this tactic was later used by the Russians against Napoleon, and also in World War II in Operation Barbarossa. This was the first Mongol invasion into the Rus principalities, and the Battle of Kalka River took place pretty much where Mariupol is today. At least that's where the river is that they crossed, the Mongols, before they fanned out and turned around, and boy did they crush the Rus princes and a lot of nobility and aristocrats, and that changed so much in the coming centuries. Alright, let's start with the Viking Age, and I've chosen a great clip for this.
I am an ambassador, damn it! I am supposed to talk to people. You may yet have the opportunity.
In the movie The 13th Warrior, Antonio Banderas plays Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who met with the Vikings on the Volga. That's only in the start of the movie, and his descriptions are quite interesting.
They bid me take my place among them in the halls of Valhalla, where the brave may live forever.
Now it's very good to start here, because this is actually a pretty cool description of early Vikings on the rivers far to the east. But this takes us back to the first RUS Vikings. And as I said, the stories are pretty much the same up until this Battle of Kalka River. And let's not buy into everything Ibn Fadlan wrote, shall we? We'll leave this movie alone now, as it from here on goes really far into Beowulf's world.
The kingdom is under attack. Their villages destroyed. They are menaced by an ancient evil.
I'll make a pause here for a disclaimer, because I've been to Mariupol, all around Azov, and on Crimea, as you see here, on a research expedition, and I know this area very well, I'd say, and especially as a historian. And I got many, both Russian and Ukrainian friends, and I love them all. So these are really, really hard times, also for me personally. And it's horrible to witness a brother war, as we call it in Norwegian, when brothers kill each other. And lots of politicians and I guess all the people pulling strings above our heads. And these really, really strange and turbulent times. So this is why it's important for me to bring some knowledge out there. From a historical perspective, of course. And I'll do that by comparing Ukraine and Belarus and Russian history. I'll try to make it really simple so it's easy to get a overview. And perhaps that can help some, because I see there's a lot of propaganda out there. Now this research trip was very interesting and we learned a lot. And I've got some info on that on my Patreon channel, but that's not what this video is about. Now to learn more about the differences and similarities between Belarusians and Ukrainians and Russians, we need to go back to pagan times and the roots of Christianity among the RUS Vikings. So let's do that. Meet Olga, Olga of Kiev. She was the first RUS Viking who was a Christian, and she was the daughter-in-law of Rurik. And boy, did she have a taste for revenge. I find it good to start with Olga, even though she was the daughter-in-law of Rurik, the first of the RUS princes, because with her and her grandson Vladimir and Christianity, so many things changed for the RUS. You see this painting here. This is supposed to depict Rurik with his two brothers being asked by the different Slavic tribes to organize and help and rule and govern, which they did according to the chronicles. And it's interesting the way these principalities were, because they didn't have like the other places where the Vikings settled that the eldest son inherits everything. Here, brother inherited before son, which is the perfect way to spread your rule as a clan over as large an area as possible. But it's very easy to divide and conquer if a golden horde comes in from the east, which happened. So Rurik and many other Vikings came over from Scandinavia. I'll say something about his DNA in just a bit. His two brothers had their own territories, but they died fairly quickly. So it was Igor, the son of Rurik, who continued sort of like building the legacy of this clan. And his wife was Olga. In Scandinavia we would call her Helga. And she is famous for her revenge and her trickery on the Drevlians, which she fooled manyfold. But it was her son Svatoslav who conquered both far east and southwards. And when he took Atil and destroyed the Khazar Khanate, right where Volga goes out into the Caspian Sea on the border of Kazakhstan even, very close to where Volgograd, meaning Stalingrad in World War II, was. When he destroyed Atil, no grape or raisin remained, not a leaf on a branch. That was pretty devastating, no doubt. Now, a lot of historians don't focus enough about the importance of trade. And when the RUS Vikings took over the Khazar Khanate and their trading empire, that really started something long-lasting for the RUS. And now we're getting to Vladimir the Great. He's the one responsible for the Orthodox Christianity, not the Catholic one, and also the Cyrillic script. And here's a fun fact for you. It was Earl Håkon, the very early in Valhalla Vikings TV show, who helped Vladimir to regain his power as an heir of the RUS. So as you can see here, by 980, not only had Vladimir consolidated his position in modern-day Belarus, Russia and Ukraine, and secured the frontiers, but his choice of Orthodox Christianity and the Cyrillic script really managed to cement and separate the RUS from the rest in the West. It's also from this time, supposedly, that modern Russia stems, as we know Vladimir not only worshipped Perun before he became a Christian, that is thunder god Thor, but also Mongols, who's apparently the mother goddess, and thus Mother Russia. Now, like his grandmother, Vladimir was a tough guy, there's no doubt about that. And this wife of his, the Swedish princess Rogneda, man, she must have lived a tough life. But it's their son, Yaroslav the Wise, who's perhaps even more important, because he cemented so much as a lawgiver. And more importantly, he reigned for a long time. And as these RUS principalities grew both in number and in size, for the next 150 years, more and more nobles came out and fought against each other and competed, and eventually a lot of them lost their lives in the Battle of Kalka and were subjugated to the Golden Horde. I'm using some video clips here from some Russian and Ukrainian films because it's very telling how they want to remember their own history. And I hope I'm not scaring you off now, but the people in these three countries have been through so many horrifying things throughout history. But in this video, the question is it the same history, or are there variations here which are pretty significant? And Putin wrote here that it's the same RUS Viking background, but it was fragmented. Let's hear what he has to say.
Но в основе своей истории и по той же религии огромного количества связей, причем родственных связей близких. Это по сути.
This fragmentation is very interesting, as you can see here. Let's hear what Ukrainian politician and political ally of Putin, Viktor Medvedchuk, has to say about this. Now remember, Putin is even godfather to his daughter.
These are two distinct nations, proceeding from today and for the last 200 to 300 years. There is the Russian nation, there is the Ukrainian nation. But these are close nations. These are Slavic Orthodox peoples. This is the basis of civilization characteristics, community of Russia and Ukraine.
Now what he is talking about is that there was significant fragmentation even within Ukraine. Now I need to add here that there was a lot of conquering and warfare. And he goes on.
There is a different faith, a different history, and different languages.
So up until the birth of Alexander Nevsky, only 2 years before this Battle of Kalka River, well, it's good that we have him here now. He was a key figure, as you will see here, in securing the legacy of the Russian statehood and the Golden Horde. And he also ruled over both Novgorod, Tver, future Moscow, and Kiev. And then there's this battle. Music from Prokofiev. This battle on the ice about 780 years ago was very, very significant in securing Orthodox Christianity. And also against the Swedes in the Battle of Neva, that was another important battle. So from here on, this fragmentation started happening really fast. A lot of things started happening, and much for the worse. But this also made Moscow rise up and become more powerful than all the other principalities. Meanwhile, Novgorod had problems up in Scandinavia, as they had to pay tribute to the Golden Horde and went up there to fetch slaves even. Treaties were signed, but it didn't help much. Now, before we start comparing these different regions and starting with Russia, I'd like to take a short moment to talk about the bogatirs and the boyars. Knights and nobles were already spread out far in all the principalities, and I believe this contributed significantly to this fragmentation that Putin talks about. Like you see here, how the boyars in the modern Belarus and Ukraine would incorporate into Lithuanian and Polish nobility. And this sparked or started a great movement of peoples in so many directions. Like you see here from the text that Putin wrote, the fragmentation intensified after Batı Khan's devastating invasion. Now I'd like to show you one of the coolest bogatirs, and a clip from a movie on the horrible destruction of Ryazan. Of course, it's hard to imagine how it must have been in the 1200s and 1300s with the Mongol invasions and the Golden Horde and everyone who was taken as, into slavery, and everyone who died. I mean, this was just upheaval of the worst kind, and in the middle here we had Black Death even, and lots of plague and climate worsening. Up until this time period, as I've tried to talk about, things were a little bit calm compared to what happened in the next 3-4 centuries until the late 1700s. And this is what I'm trying to get to with this video, to say that yes, the fragmentation and the splits into different, what turned out to be different countries. Well, a lot of things has been going on. There's a lot of things in common trauma, experience, and all these new mixings of people. It all changed a lot. And that brings me to something which it's largely forgotten in the West when they talk about the slave trade. Everyone talks about down to Northwest Africa in the Mediterranean. But let's not forget about all the millions of people. I've seen numbers 2-3 million slaves that were brought from all the RUS territories and down through Crimea into the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't until Potemkin, under Katarina the Great, managed fiercely to get control over Crimea that things started to change. This is very important in trying to understand why Crimea is so significant, because the history of the Crimean Khanate and all the terror of slavery, and this most likely also explains the huge deportation of Crimean Tatars and the de-Tatarization of Crimea that went on for such a long time. But of course, a lot of people in Soviet experienced deportation. We'll get to that. And if you didn't know this, Crimea, the name Crimea, comes from the Sumerians. On a lighter note, let's look at the DNA here. Wikipedia has a pretty good overview, and I've sorted it out here now so you can compare the average Russian Y DNA, that's only men, with Belarusian and Ukrainian DNA. And the blue lines going downwards, they differ, meaning there's a lot more farmer DNA from old times and different kinds of hunter-gatherer DNA from really old times. And also the Rurik families, supposedly, and N haplogroup. I'll put links down below so you can read up for yourselves if you wish. And if you thought the Rurik dynasty was dead and long gone, died with the Romanovs when they took over in the early 1600s, no, it's not like that at all. They're alive and living, even have several Facebook pages, as you can see here, and a very active community, very international, I must say. But there are others, also descendants of the Rurik dynasty, like the very much alive Obolensky family, And the Trubetskoy, they mixed in also with the Lithuanian nobility, and families like Sapieha, who also mixed in with Polish nobility in addition to Lithuanian. I also mentioned the farmer DNA, which probably goes even back to the early Western hunter-gatherers. Then, of course, it's interesting that there's, as you can see in the map here, a lot of I1. And even with the Q, which you find a lot of in Sweden, you find specific lines, so it's possible to get a indication of the spread of Viking DNA in the present-day RUS population. And I'll throw in something on the Cossacks and the Khazars from even earlier back in time. We now know that they were mixed, very much so. It's no surprise, really. But there is a surprising large amount of I1, it seems, among Cossacks. I know many have been interested in the Khazar DNA with the hypothesis that they are connected somehow with the Ashkenazi Jews, but they also seem to be have mixed genetic origins, as it says here, for the nobility, that is. In general, on the DNA side, people have mixed a lot, and especially where there's a lot of trade, and that certainly goes for this area. And please don't forget that there is a past here, quite significant past in the Bronze Age and even earlier back into the ancient North Eurasians. So there's a different composition here, from the starting point even. Now, regarding all these fragmentations, we'll now look at what happened when this Golden Horde came and mixed everything so much up, and compared the history between Moscow, Belarus, and Ukraine. And I must say, it's quite interesting for me as a historian to look at this time period for the next 200-300 years here. How this Golden Horde and their descendants afterwards tried to divide and conquer and rule and exert their power in these most horrible ways. And for Moscow's sake, it all started with Alexander Nevsky's son Daniel, ruling over an apparently small duchy, which really grew, and even absorbed the Grand Duchy of Tver in 1485. And here's a fun fact for those of you who don't know this. President Putin's family is from Tver, going really far back. And his grandfather was actually Lenin and Stalin's personal chef. So in the history of Moscow, you can see here how the growth of the Duchy of Lithuania, including present-day Belarus and Ukraine, became so great that the Golden Horde and the Khan wanted to strengthen Moscow, and that's how Moscow grew. And eventually in 1480, they were able to break free from Tatar control. It's really impressive to look at how Ivan the Great expanded the medieval Muscovy state. But they weren't free from the Golden Horde, who now had become Crimean Tatars. And as the Lithuanian Duchy expanded greatly and became very threatening, there was a lot of Muscovite-Lithuanian wars. Frankly, the 16th century was a horrible time for all people living in these areas. And it certainly didn't get any better with Ivan the Terrible, who after losing his wars and had a lot of problems with Crimean Tatars, consolidated his power with something called Obrichnina, which essentially were massacres combined with the first deportations. And then came the times of troubles, reducing the Russian population by about a third, down to 4 million. The famine was caused by this volcano in Peru, which effectively was the end of Rurik rule. And with this, the Rurik dynasty ended in Moscow. This was one of the most turbulent and violent periods in Russian history. It was devastating, no doubt. And it led to a violent civil war, which included the Polish and Lithuanian nobility. By this time they were quite in with the Ruthenians. And then things got even worse for the peasants. The Romanovs had taken over, and they were fortunate to have a period of peace, which then led the Cossacks to revolt against the Poles in present-day Ukraine, and Russians, of course, backing them. And that, of course, led to a war between Russia and Poland. And as you can see here, the boyars decided to cooperate with the Romanovs. Together with serfdom, they placed an overwhelming burden on the peasants. Now, this more recent history that comes after this, in the 1700s with Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, and the acquisition of Polish territories, and a lot of growth, really. Well, that's more well known, so I'll leave it here and I'll move on to Novgorod, and we'll start over going back in time. Well, the reason why I'm bringing up Novgorod is because I've been there. It's a great place to visit, very historical. But this is also regarding the famine, the massacre, and the deportations. And throughout the centuries, these deportations actually gave growth to the places where they were reported. And a lot of people remained, so there you have a sort of like genetic spread of these Novgorod RUS Viking genes. So what about Belarus? I mean, as you can see here, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania really grew, and eventually they mixed, blended in with Poland. And major centers such as Novgorod, but also Polotsk in Belarus and Kiev grew and became more and more important. And in the Duchy of Lithuania, the Ruthenians had a very special position, and even the Orthodox Christianity helped them maintain a sort of identity, I guess. But they too had a problem with slavery and the Tatar raids. Man, that was devastating. Here it says 3 million. But things took an even worse turn for Belarus. It's called the Deluge. And Poland, Polish people know a lot about that. With conflict and violent wars on all different fronts, in all directions. As you see here, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth lost 1/3 of its population. I mean, if things were bad in the 16th century, it definitely continued in Belarus in the 17th. And here, look at this, I'll show you something interesting. Part of the legacy of the old RUS principalities is that they, around this time, got colors, like white Russians, black Russians, and red Russians. Even present-day Moldova was part of that. And if you now move on to Kiev and Ukraine, we see the same pattern becoming vassal states under the Golden Horde, Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Poland, and then Russia. And it's precisely these distinctions which President Putin called fragmentation. That's my main point here. Because as these cities and present-day countries grew in different directions, they all had this basis in former RUS principalities. Now, does that make them one nation? I don't know, I'll let you decide. Did the spread of Magdeburg law in any way contribute to these differences between Russia and Belarus and Ukraine? I mean, Kiev it lasted until 1834, that's kind of late. And no doubt the nobility in Belarus and Ukraine had a very different position than in Russia. So everyone suffered, of course, from famine, like you see here, like I mentioned earlier. And in Kiev also they suffered greatly by the domination by the Golden Horde. So my point has been largely this huge split in history, almost like a discontinuity, like when I talk about the Viking Age or time periods before Viking Age. This is almost like a period of Ragnarok where everything disintegrates and then becomes rebuilt with new powers emerging. And the effects of this dreadful period of slavery all the way up until the 1700s, that must have been so devastating. Sheer madness, really. So if the goal is to come together in all the suffering and all the blood that has been spilt, well, that's another issue. And of course all the boyars and other noble families were spread out all around. That created differences also, like the boyars and RUS princes and the families that merged into the nobility of the Lithuanian and Polish. And especially the power and position of the Polish nobility, which was intertwined very much so in present-day Kiev, contributed greatly to this later fragmentation throughout the 19th century. So it's no wonder then that when Russians make movies about their past, it contains a lot of suffering. I mean, this trauma that they have collectively been through, it's just unbelievable. You can't even grasp it. And I haven't even started with the 20th century, and I won't go there too much except mentioning the dekulakization that went on, all the deportations, decossacization that went on. I mentioned the Crimean Tatars, but look at the Lithuanians. I mean, they were transported to far remote regions, far to the east. And for the 20th century, I mean, we can just look at the death toll or the tolls of how many people have been deported. And on my travels, both in Kazakhstan and all the different former Soviet states, I've met and talked with many of them. And these numbers you see here, they don't even take into account all the people who died from starvation in the famines of the 20th century. Not just the Holodomor in Ukraine, but in Kazakhstan and many other places, with millions dead. And of course you have the Gulag stories, which Solzhenitsyn wrote so terribly well about. A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich has always been a very strong book for me to have read when I was young. So if you look at history chronologically, it's difficult to imagine if things can get worse for every century that goes on. And then you got the 20th century and all the horror that went on by these rulers, these Bolsheviks, whom we now know so much about. This brings me back to the atrocities of the 20th century, and I've always thought for myself, how was it possible for these people, for normal people, to do these things? Like during Operation Barbarossa. Then this guy came along with the book Blitz. And it turns out the Soviets drank vodka, which was very good for faint retreats, by the way. While the Nazis used meth, and it wasn't just a little meth, to keep them aggressive and also awake for their blitzkrieg. They must have thought they were kind of superhuman, till the Nazi leaders, I mean those that weren't overly drugged, found out it's quite addictive with meth. And if you ever wondered what happened to the company that produced all these millions and millions of pills of Pervitin, well, they're doing well, owned by Big Pharma. In turn is owned by BC Partners, a competitor of BlackRock. Now that's far over our heads, so let's not care too much about that. When Elem Klimov made a terrifying movie, Come and See, back in 1985, it's not only about his own youth in Stalingrad when the Nazis were there, but it's also a movie about Belarus and the horrible things that went on there. Klimov's parents were apparently staunch communists, but his fathers in the 50s led the rehabilitation of victims of Stalinist repression. To me, this movie is a horrible document of war, and I unfortunately saw it at too young an age. Now, I took this last clip here from another YouTube video, link below, because it's important to understand how some of the Russian leaders might view the map of Europe from their perspective. Like when the Germans came, or how vulnerable one can feel. One should never underestimate geography, as well as history. So I hope this video has been somewhat useful. And before we go on bringing a yoga mat to war, and before the Swedish army decides to join in, and if you're preparing to become a full-time hardcore prepper, I'll leave you with this photo and a part of a song from Short Paris, a Russian band singing here with World War II veterans.